Thank you very much. After that really fun morning session, we're going to have a lunchtime discussion. We're going to actually have 3 presentations on possible directions for research on green buildings. I'm going to start out with my own take in a quick form and then turn it over to each of the presenters. I was at a conference about 3 or 4 years ago where an economist, some of you probably know, Eric Zitzowitz, gave a paper about financial investment behavior and showing how poorly people make financial investment decisions. And at that conference I asked the question whether there was anything special about the way people made decisions about financial investments, or if this was just a really easy area to measure it so that we could tell exactly how stupid they were being with their investments. And I think this is sort of at the opposite extreme. Unlike the financial behavior where they're really good metrics and we know exactly numerically what they invested in, what the alternatives were, and so forth, this is an area where it's probably fuzzier than almost any other area and more difficult to know exactly what the counterfactuals are. Thus my comment this morning about being baffled by people who are baffled by inefficient behavior, certainly part of this is an area where we're still working on this sort of intersection between the human behavior side and getting the sort of more traditional economic analysis right. So what we're going to do today at lunch is have 3 presentations by 3 researchers who have thought about various different aspects of this. We're going to actually change the order slightly. We're going to go around the table here. Bjorn's going to go first, then Jiro, then Stefano. And they're each going to give short presentations on their takes on this topic. We'll have a bit of discussion, and I hope some discussion from you folks, and also about other areas that you might think are ripe for continued research. So we'll start out with Bjorn.
Okay.
So this is my first slide. So I want to present some ideas on research that is perhaps somewhat remotely related to green buildings, but anyhow. They are certainly related to the discussion this morning. Not the first one, but anyhow, as you know, about 50% of the global population lives in cities, and this fraction is growing very rapidly. And according to some estimates, this means that during the coming 30 years, as large a volume of cities and urban neighborhoods will have to be constructed as we have constructed during the last 3,000 years. So there's of course reason to think about urban sustainability, especially if you work with green buildings. If you look upon the literature in urban economics, very little is said about the environment. In fact, I could find only 2 papers. One by Peter Newton and his colleagues at CSIRO in Australia, and they used integrated transport, land, environmental models to simulate the development. And they made scenarios where the cities were developing along corridors, or they were becoming more compact, or they were they had more sprawl, etc. And they found that the urban form significantly affects the urban environment, of course. And then also in a recent paper by Glaser, they found that the emission of carbon dioxide varies, of course, between various US cities, but also that the urban form has an influence. So what I think would be a good idea would to try to extend the kind of studies made by Stephen Shepard. He used satellite images first he took a sample of some 160 cities all over the world, and then he used satellite images to find out how much the land cover had changed over a certain period. And then he sent his student to these cities and found out about income changes, how the price of transport has changed, how the price of farming land has changed, etc. And I think by adding to this kind of studies data on the energy consumption in cities, you could do a lot more than he did. And I think the satellite images, they are becoming better and better all the time. So my first idea is to relate the field of green buildings to that of urban sustainability. This is just to show that US comes out rather good compared to Europe when it comes to CO2 emissions if you relate it to the GDP. If you relate it to per capita. No, on the, where do I have? Yeah, you see you are on the same level as EU. So what I really wanted to show is that those countries that were earlier heavily regulated, they are the worst. Just to start the discussion again about regulation versus prices. And you heard a lot yesterday from Randall Bowie about the strong ambitions that the European Union have, and I think they also have a very strong belief in regulations. Here are some of the examples we heard about yesterday, and I think this one conclusion is that we would really need studies of the political science kind, where you try to find out why do different countries choose different balances between regulations and prices, and why does it differ between different sectors of the economy? Has it to do with the kind of expertise that works? For example, one hypothesis would be that since very many engineers are involved in environmental discussions, this has added to the probability of having regulations. But of course I don't know. Anyhow, if you look upon Sweden, I looked in the national accounts before going here, and to the left you have the housing consumption in Sweden. And as you can see, the housing consumption increased somewhat during the last 12 years, from 2006, between 2006 and 1994. At the same time, the number of housing units also increased somewhat, but not very much. But then housing consumption includes consumption of electricity and other gas and other fuels. And as you can see, the consumption of energy decreased during the same period. So the question is this decrease related to tighter regulations? No, I don't think they are. I think they are related to the fact that the price development. So from 1994, as you can see here, or 1996 rather, the price in the 2007 price level increased all the time. And this is really not the energy price, this is the price that per kilowatt hour that the household pays. So if you look upon the energy price, you have to the left, that's the price of the grid service plus the price of electricity. So you see it has increased. And this is in current prices. So it has increased. It's not doubled, but it's increased rapidly. But if you look upon the taxes that you pay, we have a CO2 tax. We have one tax that forces the energy companies to use a certain fraction of renewable resources in order to produce their electricity, and we have a value-added tax. So the taxes, they have more than doubled during this period. And now the taxes in percent, they were about a third earlier, and now they are over 40%. So my guess is that this has been the most important factor behind the reduction of energy consumption. I guess that many owners of single-family housing, they have invested in what you call heat pumps, for example, or they have invested in using heat from the ground, etc. So I think that's the reason. So I think we really need to look closer into what we discussed this morning. To what extent do regulations differ from the prices and tax or market-oriented mechanism when it comes to energy savings? How do they influence, in the long run, the investments in different kinds of innovations? And what are the costs? I mean, if you have regulations, we know that you will have rent-seeking behavior of various kinds. So then that should also be included in the cost, I think. And then shortly about the Swedish work with performance certificates. So recently, or some years ago, a Swedish standard was developed jointly by a group of people from the construction industry, from real property people, and also people from the government. And this system is much simpler than the LEED and the Green Star and the others we heard about, because that's mainly what the people from the construction company wanted. They wanted a simple system. But anyhow, it would be interesting to have research upon differences between these systems when it comes to their effect on energy savings, etc., which I think we know very little about. And also you could have a kind of research on what's the optimal design of such systems. We heard yesterday during the lunch that, of course, they have found a way in the European Union to agree upon something, but I don't know if that's always the optimal solution. And then I think that someone talked, I think it was just someone today talked about this principal agent problem, about what kind of information end users have, etc. So we are currently planning an experiment that I think would be interesting to perform, where we work together with a real estate company, a large one, and the city of Stockholm. And the idea is to offer office employees daily information about their energy consumption the day before, and also about the expected consumption if they choose to go for their traveling, if they choose to go by car or by taxi or by public transport, let's say to the airport or something. And of course, the purpose is to find out to what extent you can save on energy consumption just by providing people with information. And then I would like to underline what I think someone said this morning, that it's very important also to look upon the rebound effects. In a recent study, Swedish study, they found actually that the initial savings of 20% in the transport and heating sector would eventually, through rebound effects, lead to increased carbon emissions with 5%. I don't know if I believe this, but anyhow, it points to the importance of including rebound effects when you discuss the constraint or the savings that you can achieve. Okay? No more slides.
Our second speaker is Jiro Yoshida from Penn State, but he will be speaking about Japan.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be on the panel today. And in this conference, there have been a lot of discussion on the United States and the EU. So in this opportunity, I'd like to provide some information about the other side of the globe. And I like to emphasize that the other side is not the dark side. Okay. All right. So specifically, I'd like to talk about three things. One, attitudes of Japanese households and real estate investors to green buildings based on survey data. Two, Japanese public policy programs for green buildings, and there are a couple of interesting programs. Three, potential research opportunities. All right, this slide shows a household's attitude to green buildings in Japan. The survey question is, what is your attitude to installing the following eco-friendly equipment in your house? And the list of equipments include solar power system, cogeneration system, and insulation retrofit. And overall result is pretty negative against the green building. The green bars represent an absolutely no interest of, of having those investments. Okay? And usually we know that reviewed preference is pretty different from stated preference like this. So we have even weaker expectation about their actual actions. And results are mainly financial. About half of people said no interest, listed financial reasons, red and green and purple financial reasons. But one interesting segment is the last 30%. They don't have no special reason to say absolutely no interest in investments. Okay, so it might be the case that this survey was just a bother to them, but another possibility is that there might be a strong status quo bias in the household's decision making. Then in that case, even more stronger policy measures are required to encourage those people into green investments. And this result is for real estate investors. And again, similarly, investors' response is pretty negative. The clever way of question in this survey is that the survey question is, which environmental issues do you emphasize most in your investment decision making? And those include like, and then the red circled part, mainly for green buildings, like lighting control and energy usage and resource usage. Among those quote-unquote environmental issues, investors put least emphasis on those green building aspect of, and they put more emphasis on like earthquake resistance and internal air quality and transportation convenience. Those are directly relevant for tenants' satisfaction. Okay. So overall, so according to survey data, we have pretty negative results for the green investments. And I don't think this is particularly special in Japanese investors. So let's take a look at a couple of interesting public policy programs in Japan. Especially Tokyo Metropolitan Government is one of the most active local governments for the green building. And they started in 2002 their own green building program. And the program is about the evaluation and the planning. So within the plan, do, check process, it is about checking and the planning and no enforcement of the effort. But interesting thing is that the program is mandatory because it is embedded to the building permit process. So it is not a voluntary certification program, but it's mandatory. And so currently we have 1,500 projects under this program, and we have some data about those planning and evaluation. And the further interesting one is Tokyo Cap and Trade Program for the standard buildings. And this started in April of this year. And the program initially had just an evaluation and planning system between 2002 and 2010. And we had, there were some positive effects because, based on this previous program, but the effects were not too strong. So the government decided to enhance the program by imposing cap and a trading program. And then in this design, interesting thing is that, so obviously reduction is mandatory, and the target is for 1,400 large buildings, including office buildings and educational facilities and factories. But also, this program restricts tenants. Okay, so yesterday we had a big discussion about the incentive alignment of interest between tenants and owners and so on, especially during the operational phase. And this cap and trade program is for the operation of the buildings. And so the program correctly identifies the issue, and in this program, all tenants are obligated to cooperate with the owner, and even larger tenants are required to submit their own plans. And so this program started this year, so we don't have any trading yet. So from next year, we're going to have some trades about the offsets, and so in the future, we're going to see those data too. Okay. And outside of Tokyo, 13 local governments have adopted another assessment tool called CASB. And as Bjorn explained, there are many, many different assessment systems around the world, and this is one of them. And currently, about 4,000 projects are evaluated under this program. And here's the list of many, many different assessment tools around the world. So in the future, probably, as Bjorn said, it might be interesting to compare the differences and consequences of those different assessment tools. So research opportunities in Japan. So there are both advantages and disadvantages in Japanese data. Advantages are that first, Tokyo has the largest office stock, and Tokyo's office stock is 50% greater than New York and 300% greater than London. So it has a huge potential. And also there are a wealth of physical information and engineering information. So 4,000 CASB information and 3,000 Tokyo information about emissions. So those physical information is abundant in Japan. And in addition to that, appraisal price data contains a lot of hedonic characteristics. So there's a potential for those parts. But a disadvantage is a lack of price data, especially market transaction price data. So I have been working on collecting those transaction price data for the past 2 years, as John and Pete and Niels understand well. And only recently, there is some progress on the use of those price data. So by combining those market price data with those physical and engineering information, in the future, there will be a greater opportunities for the research using Japanese data. And again, in the future, from next year, we're going to have emission trading data about the standard office building. And so EU cap and trade program is about the plants and factories. And this program is for standard buildings. So it is kind of unique efforts. Okay? But when we think about cross-country analysis, we have to be careful about the different structures of market conditions and market structure and leasing structures. And especially, there are many, many factors affecting the cross-country differences, but we have to be particularly careful about the differences in the social value and type of lease contracts and bargaining power of tenants. Especially in Japanese case is the upper left part of the table, and roughly speaking, many leases are gross lease. Okay? And in that case, if the green building has greater cost efficiency, that surplus may not be captured in the rent number itself. So if we just think about the effect of green building on the rent level, the result can be misleading. And when we compare European result, American result, and the Japanese result, we have to be really careful about those different lease structures and so on. All right, so, I hope that I sufficiently advertised the attractiveness of the use of Asian or Japanese data. So, right, let's conclude
And our third speaker is our own Stefano DellaVigna.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. I think I was called here to represent another dark side, which is the behavioral economist. So I'm going to try to say something about what can psychology and economics or behavioral economics say about, in general, about energy savings and something about green buildings. So I think some of these things will be things that are kind of obvious, maybe sound trivial, but I think a lot of the times if we don't keep them in mind, we may forget them. Okay, so the debate on energy savings mostly highlights the importance of investments in certain dimensions. For example, insulation is very important, or efficient air conditioning, different energy efficient appliances, and there is an aspect of can we get energy that makes those more efficient? Can we get research to make those more efficient and kind of give an incentive for people to purchase them? And just sometimes doing the research to make a car 10% more efficient, an air conditioner, can cost a lot. It's kind of the hard science research. So it has huge upside, but the science research tends to be very costly. So one of the things I'm going to want to say is that economics, and in particular psychology into economics, has the potential to have very cheap research with high upside. Now, that's not going to be easy to find, but it nicely complements the more technology-based. And that's a lot of the methods, like a lot of things that we've been talking about, which is we should have better ways for people to borrow, and that's part of it. But I'm going to decompose that. So if we talk about just economics, if you take it from a bird's eye perspective, one way to think about it is what can economists contribute to this? Well, first of all, the right incentives. So how can we set incentives so that individuals on their own choose more energy efficient green buildings? That's fine. I would say another thing that I thought, I didn't manage to go to many sections I was teaching with yesterday and today, but looking at the papers, I was really impressed about a number of these natural experiments at the state level, local level, that looks at certification in different areas at different time, and how really we start to narrow down the effect of Green Star and European certification. So that's great. I think economists are very good at kind of natural experiments, and so even though there wasn't an exact experiment, identifying exactly, just being the statistician, identifying exactly what kind of certification work and which one doesn't. So that's fine. And I think we'd really love to convince policymakers when they roll out new environmental programs to maybe do it in a experimental way, so go first in an area, then another, and so that we can do an even clear examination of that. So what about the behavioral economists? What does that, who is that, and what does that do? Well, the idea is to supplement this stuff that we all believe in, and to pay even more attention to consumer psychology. So in particular, the idea of nudges that dictator has pushed for, the idea is that there sometimes are simple things that is going to make a difference between incentives that people pay attention to and incentives that people don't pay attention to. And so here is, and the idea is the psychology. If something works, is very cheap because it might just vary what font you use or how you frame is a gain or a loss. And so that's where, if we can get a big impact, that can be very useful. So here is an example, and most of you will probably know this, but if you don't, it's interesting. So this is Cialdini's team of kind of psychologists in the following field experiment, then followed up by some electricity companies. And they actually targeted 290 households in this town of San Marcos in California. It's very bare bones experiment. They just had visible meters. They just walked that NRA, walked by, measured the meter, and then they left some flyers in some households and not others, informing people they were above the median or below the median energy consumption. It was just as simple as that. Just drop a flyer hanger. So very cheap. And then in some cases they just did that. In another case they did that, but on top of it they gave a smiley face if you actually were below the median, and a frowning face if you were above the median. So what did that? And then they measured the energy consumption exposed. Now this can be done better. 290 households. It's a small sample, but what did that do? You can see how this is low cost to do. So the key finding here, this is the average, the units here are in kilowatt hour consumption per day, and the baseline is 10 for the below median consumption household and 20. So these are not percent, these are levels. So the effects are going to be 5–10%, so big effects. So the first one is with the one without the faces, just giving information. And lo and behold, what happens that the households that were consuming less than average, they say, gee, I was consuming less than average, I can consume more. So that's this group here. The houses that were above average are saying, I should cut my consumption, and they do. So on average, maybe there is a relative increase. These are confidence intervals, so both are significant, not huge precision of the statistic, but take it as a suggestive study. But so then the psychologist said, I actually don't know whether they had this ex ante or they came to it, they said, well, let's try to reward the people psychologically for doing the right thing. So they put the smiley face. If you put a smiley face, once you tell people you're consuming less than average, people don't increase their consumption. It's like, oh, that's great. You told me I'm a good guy. So this is sort of like saying, isn't that a small difference for as economists? What's a smiley face? We could put it in the utility function exposed, but ex ante, you wouldn't necessarily have thought of that as the first thing in a field experiment. But it turns out that makes a difference of about, taking point estimate, 5% of your energy consumption, because this is so now again this has been replicated and the effects are a bit smaller, but it does appear that somewhere between 2 to 5% is a real decrease. And now the frowning face have on the higher than average have at least as big effect, and it turns out when you implement this more broadly, people really get upset if you give them a frowning face. But so I guess the message is, do you like this or not? But the message is it can be powerful. Think of how much cheaper it is to lower energy consumption 5%, to do this, maybe sending letters that remind, versus having to design an appliance that is more efficient. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but this is great. Now there's lots of questions. Is this temporary or permanent? Maybe this just works for a few days. So they show some effect. It seems to stay after a few months. But this is precisely the kind of questions that we should answer. But we can borrow some of the work from creative psychologists like Bob Cialdini. So let me just say something very briefly. 3 ideas for green buildings. All fairly obvious, but I think important to keep in mind. Simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. So recent research in behavioral economics, psychology economics, says limited attention is key. From investors, it appears that investors neglect things that are more complicated, even when there's a lot at stake. Taxes, the work from Radchetty et al. Says, if you make the taxes salient in a store, people purchase it less, as if they didn't know that they were paying taxes on it. Shipping costs on eBay, people don't pay as much as the shipping costs as they pay to total price. So on such simple things, people seem to be almost half inattentive, if you give me a magnitude. So it's obvious as this would, limited attention and even in things that are pretty simple is going to be key. So my simple take would be, if you're going to do labels, keep them very simple. So maybe like a green star could work, that could be, or maybe even better, a label that clarifies the monetary savings. So why can't we make labels on buildings as simple as sale in a store? You go in, huge, like minus $2 less than normal, right? That really draws in people. So why can't we become marketing experts in selling public policy? Is there something wrong with that? So in a way, thinking about the right psychological way to frame the savings. It could be like little bars, but maybe making it under some assumption, projected over 20 years, this is the future saving, making it clear that, again, it's a pretty obvious thing, but I think we want to pay more attention to this than just, there is incentives, people will do it right. Well, probably not unless they can really see through it. So the other thing is this kind of says that mandatory requirements, like mandatory standards, are paternalistic, but they're probably going to be more effective because they kind of if they force people through something, they bypass this limited attention. The second thing is that impatience is a big deal. So everywhere we find evidence that people discount the future heavily, whether you might have heard of hyperbolic discounting or just myopia, but clearly future payoffs get a substantial discount, and maybe more than we would like ex ante. So that's kind of the idea of hyperbolic discounting. But so here's the problem. Energy savings almost always have immediate costs and delayed benefits. So just right there, we will underinvest in energy savings. So that's a possible reason for the classical finding that people tend to purchase appliances that are not very efficient air conditioners. So now how some of it is, well, maybe we can improve the labels. So like at the store, make the more energy efficient appliances, the saving frame over a 10-year life of the appliance as salient as a sale on the price of the item. You know, there might be some way that we can do it. And also, just the financing schemes are very important. Sort of like, I think, kind of with presentations on this, is just if there is some way to have the financing so people don't pay all the cost ex ante and maybe get some of the benefits. Like when I recently purchased sort of like a energy efficient dishwasher, such a pain to get the rebate. If that was automatic at the store, that might matter. So again, very simple things, but let's not assume that there is small cost. I think transaction cost, these things are going to matter quite a bit. And then something maybe kind of a little bit more subtle is, here's a classical experiment, not for real stakes, but intuition is probably right. You ask two groups of people, or here, there is a cell phone valued of a price of $100. Would you drive 10 minutes across town to purchase it in another store where it costs $90? A bunch of people say yes. Different group of people, you tell them you're about to buy a television that costs $2,000. You can drive across town 10 minutes and save $20. People say, oh, I won't do that. Why would I do for just $20? And so this kind of idea that people don't look at magnitudes per se, but because we don't have a great idea sometimes of $20 or $10, they use percents as a reasonable heuristic. So if you do that, then think about, this is one more reason why you want to have the energy saving stuff occur at construction as opposed to later. You could imagine spending $10,000 more at construction where you're going to spend $500,000. Maybe it's just a 2% cost increase. But imagine having the house and you have to, do a $10,000 bill. That's great. It's a $10,000 bill. It's out of, I don't know, whatever my normal bill for yearly bill for a house is not that big. So I think the percent type of thinking suggests a further reason why the construction, new building part is the part that might be which is consistent with most of your research and to insist on. So let me wrap up. I don't think they're free lunches from psychology. So it's not like there is a ton of unexplored things that are going to all of a sudden solve the problems. No. But there are important details that we can do experiments with, we can try out and interact with incentives. So this is not saying we shouldn't give people incentives, but maybe there is ways to give people incentives such that they respond more to it, and the additional response is not very costly. We just have to figure out the simple way, the way that appeals to the present self, that is immediate, that works out with the right percents and so on. So, and there is a lot more to the psychology. I'm not doing justice to it, but this is just examples. So there is potential for relatively low cost, high effectiveness interventions. Now, we don't have a ton of them right now, but that's why I think there should be more research on it. And, and of course, all of these complemented with the standard economic skills of thinking about incentives and evaluating these things with natural field experiment, which is great what kind of this group is doing. So that would be it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, I'm going to take the prerogative of adding a few things, some of which came to mind during those talks, that I would love to see people work on. One is, as many of you heard about, Berkeley has this financing program now for, well, it's now for solar PV. It hopefully will be for solar PV and energy efficiency eventually. And it's really built around this idea that there's big financing constraints in these investments. I'm personally skeptical, but completely open to being convinced. But as far as I know, there's no actual research on whether financing constraints are a major problem. And the obvious study would be, and maybe somebody has done this, and if somebody has, I'd love to hear about it, is to look at people who have plenty of savings and their investment in energy efficiency, and people who have much lower savings but same lifetime wealth level, for instance, and compare them. And if you found out that the people who had low savings but relatively high permanent income were not making the same investments as the people with high savings, then that'd probably be a pretty convincing reason to get into this financing issue. If you don't, I'd be a little concerned about the direction. This is a huge deal. Joe Biden was out here and touting the Berkeley program as the model that we should be following. And if we're going to really be following that, there, I guess, should be some research to support that. It's also interesting, this morning we spent a lot of time talking about responses to standards. There's relatively little research, although more, on response to information. When I teach a standard regulation course, there's this section one teaches on using information as sort of the first intervention, and then if people don't then behave efficiently, perhaps using standards as the second intervention. We've sort of jumped to looking at how those standards, and I think building standards are probably a great idea, but it would be useful, as something Stefano was highlighting, to find out a little bit more about how information works and how to make it work better. And that, of course, gets back to the need for thinking about how people actually learn about energy consumption. Many of you have already heard me talk about how this is the least salient thing we consume in our lives, particularly electricity, that we have no idea where it comes from, what we're using it for. The analogy in the industry is it's like going to the supermarket every day of the month, grabbing stuff off the shelves, and at the end of the month you get a bill that's just the total amount you owe, with no breakdown of what you bought. And that's basically how we consume electricity. And of course, if we consume groceries that way, that we probably would not have very efficient grocery consumption. So it would be interesting to learn more. I have many times, and there are people in the room from LBL, whine to my LBL colleagues, why isn't there a laminated card I can hang on my thermostat, telling me roughly at least how much it costs to turn the thermostat up 1 degree. The downside of that may be that I would find out it actually doesn't cost very much, and I'd say 72 is a much more comfortable temperature. But figuring out how you can get that information across, and maybe smiley faces are part of it, that even if they're not what economists have learned is information, and they certainly aren't, they are in some ways very salient information, and finding out what that is. There is an industry now of energy audit software. There's been an energy audit industry for years, but now there is being built sim house type software. There should soon be an industry of research on energy audit software. Many of us should be working on that, I think, thinking about how effectively that software works and what makes it work more effectively. Much of this, by the way, would be enhanced, since our PG&E colleagues are here, by access to good data on actual consumption. Matt Kachin is somewhere here. What Matt didn't quite tell you about the data they have is that he found these data on the web, and we talked about it, and I said, grab them now, because I can't believe they're going to leave them up there. And they disappeared shortly after you pulled them off the web. There are a lot of issues. I mean, these are amazing data where everybody in the country can pull down Joe Schmo's consumption at this address. That I don't think PG&E is going to make publicly available, but if the utilities would at least make some precision available to researchers, and I'm not picking on PG&E, they're just here, but all of the utilities, I think we could move a lot further in California. And then the last point, and then I would love to hear comments from the, is on the rebound effect, which gets a bad name, I think. Rebound's a good thing. Rebound is re-optimization in response to price changes, and that we should not be. Well, we have to account for it when we think about the effects. We should not think of rebound as a failure. Rebound is an optimal adjustment. People are getting value out of that rebound, and I guess I'd like to see the research think about that and try to incorporate that in a somewhat different way as just, well, this is only the net, and so some of this is a failure because people are rebounding. That's actually part of the gain, not a failure to gain. Those were my comments. Surely somebody has something to add to these. Carl.
Yeah, well, I was wondering about field experiments.
Wait. Let's see if we can get the microphone to the people who are talking. In the meantime, you could yell while it's coming.
I just wanted to suggest a field experiment. I'm not sure how familiar people are with appliance labels, but I sure would like to see, there's an FTC label that provides the kind of information, probably designed by economists, and I'd like to see a field experiment in which we did half FTC labels and half smiley faces for the most efficient appliances and see if we could determine which were more effective.
Bill Miller from PG. I'm struck by the focus on the now and the next 3 or 5 years. And what I would like in the research agendas that you pick up is that we not forget about 2050. That is, the next 3 years are just, they're not even the appetizer. That's walking through the door to the restaurant. The kinds of cuts that the climate scientists envision are necessary to forestall global climate change by 2050 represent a complete change in the way we live. That's my personal view, not my company's view. And I'd like to go back to, I think it was Matt or Matthew yesterday from BREEAM mentioned the word neighborhood, and I think Bjorn mentioned, was talking about the configuration of cities. If you go out 2050, you start thinking about entirely different ways to live. And I think we need to not forget about that and what's going to be required in terms of the behavior changes that we're going to need and all the other dimensions of that as we move into that future.
Any other contributions, thoughts about research, ideas people would like to share, to have somebody else work on? They don't have time. There are way more problems than there are people who work on them so far. Steve, introduce yourself.
I'm Steve Weissman. I'm at the law school at the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. One thing that I've actually bugged Severin about a little bit already is having come from a fairly long career at the California Public Utilities Commission, where we've steadfastly preserved the notion of charging people for electric service and in an inverted block basis. In other words, the first increment of power costs you less and the next increment costs more, and it keeps going up. We've held on to that under the faith that this type of pricing system would encourage conservation. And I guess I'm first of all fundamentally curious as to whether there's been research that's confirmed or refuted that particular assumption. I do know that people say anecdotally that everybody seems to know what their bill is, but nobody seems to know what their rate is. And you can imagine if you wanted to have a true indication of what it was going to cost you extra to buy this refrigerator versus that refrigerator. I know we currently have labeling that tries to give you some kind of a ballpark sense of that. But if you wanted a true sense, it would have to be, well, if you are using no more than 115 kilowatt hours on a monthly basis, and if we assume that this is your marginal use, then you can have the potential to save $1.50 a month if you use this refrigerator versus that refrigerator. Obviously, that level of subtlety is not going to get communicated very well. So I guess my question is, has there been research to test this notion of having inverted block rates, and is it clear that it wouldn't be better off if everybody had one rate and knew what their one rate was, and then could make some purchasing decisions on that basis?
Yes, I've done that research. Actually, I have written a paper on inverted block pricing and the elasticity, though it's being revised quite a bit right now. But it's a difficult problem, and it's actually not even clear if you knew what the right solution is, because California, for those of you who are from out of state, has increasing block pricing that runs from 10 cents for your sort of baseline consumption to 40 cents for if you're a fairly heavy consumer. 40 cents is, no one thinks the marginal cost of anything is 40 cents when it comes to power, with every environmental cost you could name. It's hard to see how you could possibly justify a price like that. And 10 cents is possibly too low for any consumption as well. So it's interesting that the California regulatory system hasn't, in fact, arrived at sort of the idea of getting the true marginal cost in there, which maybe still makes sense if there are behavioral considerations that you got to sort of shock people into paying attention. And maybe that is the sort of right message to take away from it. Over here.
Just a personal antidote to answer one of your questions about different classes of citizens. some of them maybe have a fixed income, high, but have no saving whatsoever to invest in this kind of things. Versus, I think the attitude about a utility bill, in general speaking, is a fixed amount of, it's a small percentage of things. You have mortgage, you have a very small percentage of it. So people are not paying attention because they want the energy saving is not important. I did fight with PG&E because my bill suddenly jumped up 2 years ago. Okay, then I find out the rate changes spike and so on and so forth. So I forced me to understand this is shock therapy in a sense. Okay, but I'm saying that is the psychology of paying utility bill. It's really not in everybody's head, most of us.
Yep.
Okay? I'm a retired scientist. I'm not working in this field, but I just trying to have my personal response. And I think that's something which maybe this group is interested to poke into it to find a better solution for it.
Thank you. Can you pass the, well, we got two people here.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to that gentleman's statement and say that, you know, I worry terribly that Churchill was right when he said that Americans always do the right thing after they exhausted all of the possibilities. And 2050 is a long time away, and but the urgency, assuming it's very real, we have nothing to lose if it isn't real, and we have everything to gain, including our lives if it is. I think there should be more emphasis on the fact that energy efficiency does work, and instead of trying to, as I say, determine where that 4% gain is, or it might be cut to 2%, it's so subtle that I think the genius of their exploration this morning was to actually determine that there was a 4%. We know it's also possible to have a zero energy home. What can we do to pour more emphasis on establishing which of those performance factors are cost effective and which can be pushed until they are cost effective to get the huge reductions that we need in order to survive what's coming.
Matt, I think you get the last statement, then we're going to adjourn.
Since this is a session on stimulating research, I just wanted to make a point that we should be careful that we're not always going out and rediscovering the baffling things that we've discovered in the past. And when we talk about providing more information to seeing what types of behavioral change we could get, one study, and I haven't looked at this in a long time, and so I hope I'm describing it accurately, but Dennis Eigner did one of the early studies of a field experiment where he put meters in houses that gave people real-time feedback on the price of electricity in the home. And as in the 70s, when everyone was concerned with energy as they are now, thinking that this would be a great thing and people would adjust their behaviors when they could just see the price of electricity. But it turns out that electricity is one of the best deals that we have going, and the surplus that we get from it is so big compared to what we actually have to pay that it found out that reminding people how much they were paying for electricity actually stimulated consumption because they realized, in fact, how cheap it really was. So if you're planning on doing one of these studies, you might want to go back and look at that and make sure that you're not going to fall into the same or rediscover the same baffling piece of information.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you to everyone. We're going to take a break.